This essay intends to show the significance of the specific hegemony of coded interpretations in contemporary Western cultural relation to cultural otherness. Critical reading of the aspects of cultural fascination with the other, different, unknown, and foreign is based on recognition of techniques and modes of contemporary cultural environment and the cultural patterns related to the forms of marginalization and othering. Interdisciplinary approach and cross-scientific model of semiotics, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, literary theory, and feminist theories in recent science research examine the phenomenon of alterity in ethical, political, cultural, and media domain, questioning the position of the other in discourses of culture, language, body, race, nation, gender, sex, and colonial subject, and also in the field of a new emergent monster theory. Rendered through West-East dichotomy, certain discursive issues of identity and difference, human and non-human, phenomenon of race, nation, ethnic group, class, gender, are formulated within a polarized paradigm of Western thought. Jean-Paul Sartre's Hell is Other People, ethical encounter with the other in works of Emmanuel Levinas, Gilles Deleuze's interventions in becoming and subjectivations, and Jacques Derrida's re-questioning of the concept of alterity that was radicalized in post-colonial and post-feminist theories. Those are just some of the most significant turns in thinking the difference and identity, and are the inventive forms of redefining the philosophical scene. The question of alterity is precisely the cornerstone of reinterrogating metaphysical schemes embedded in Western thought. The other is always already inscribed in the founding Platonic binarisms that are constantly rejuvenating themselves in contemporary thought, but also consistently being redefined and displaced in theoretical approaches in various fields. If the threshold of 20th and 21st century philosophical inquiry are the linguistic turn, the critique of organic representation, and the question of who or what is the subject, then these three interrelated thresholds are the starting point to examine the authority of the non-European other. 20th century marks the era of the invention of the notion of otherness as a concept of impossibility detained at the border of what is signifiable, speakable. From this limit of the language, one can only reproduce, strengthen, and maintain the practices of exclusion of the other, or as Roland Barthes puts it, language, the performance of a language system, is neither reactionary nor progressive, it is quite simply fascist, for fascism does not prevent speech, it compels speech. Being the site of construction of the other, language has always already missaid, in Beckett's terms, the other. To speak in the name of the other is to missay the other. As a cultural and political structure, language constructs the other, leaving the other only in quietude, on a place from which one cannot speak. Hence, the other does not or is not able to speak, because the other speaks within the language that made and unmade the other as such. We are therefore destined to trace the sites of knowledge production of the other with the indignity that speaking in the name of the other carries. And also we are destined, and it must be liberating and agonizing. So we are destined to stammer within the language structure, to distort the language structure with a stutter of alterity, and to develop a non-style or a style, a scripture intrinsic to the Western paradigm of thinking. The stammer is, in fact, a threatening voice, destabilizing the language of identity, or as Deleuze states, open quote, a style is managing to stammer in one's own language, not being a stammerer in one's speech, but being a stammerer of language itself, being like a foreigner in one's own language, constructing a line of flight. We must be bilingual inside our own language. We must create a minor use of our own language. The production of a discourse of otherness is actually a metonymic practice that is reducing the understanding of otherness to the essentialist needs of paradigmatic thinking. Objectification and reification practices within the knowledge production of the other are also producing the reality whose inevitable elements are precisely the figures of otherness. Places where the other resides are not geographical, even though they are named and studied through representational discourse geography. Western European political, economic, and cultural projects maintain the system of representations of the other as the uncivilized, dangerous, bestial, and in order to produce the system of asymmetrical relations of differentiation, subordination, inequality, exploitation, dependence, etc., as Milan Rakita argues, and all with the aim to reproduce and produce the image of continual progress of Western civilization. The other is a product of reductive practices, as we all know. However, the other cannot be reduced. The excess of other bodies always metonymically reduced to the sameness of the type of other narratives, myths, histories, desires, and dreams, nightmarish quite often, is the disturbing force to reckon with. To think the other is to think spaces, and to think space is to think thinking. The other is not some entity occupying the space of pure culture. The other is the being at the limit. A border is not a fixed line, undisturbed and colonized by forceful representations. A border is mobile, it contains multiplicities, and its place is not territorial but historical, it is discursive. To investigate this limit, avoiding the trap of conceptualizing it for the mere purpose of delineation between the self and the other, we need to place ourselves at the brink of cultural, political, and epistemological Western production. This approach is complex and difficult because it needs to be constantly stitched through by the other voice, tonality, and rhythm, in order to re-evaluate, deconstruct, and destabilize Western cartography and representational discourse geography. Signifying practices are not innocent or neutral. Language is the originary site of colonization, violence, and a battlefield of meaning production. The shifts in Western thinking in 20th and 21st centuries are sliding over the limits of language as a place of invention and openness towards the call of the other. And this openness assumes theoretical stance of distancing oneself from the imperialism of the same towards the oniric Derrida's heterotautological dictum of thinking and welcoming the gift of the unpredictable, uncanny, and foreign. Every other is every bit other. What follows is a short summary of an argument I made in the text named Inns and Mills of Balkan European Monster Spaces in 2014. Namely, the discourse on Balkan is elaborated and recognized in capital works of Milica Pakić-Hajdin in her book Nesting Orientalisms, The Case of Former Yugoslavia, in Maria Todorova's book Imagining the Balkans from 1997, Vesna Goldsworthy's Inventing Ruritania, The Imperialism of Imagination in 1998, Julia Kristeva's essay Bulgaria, My Suffering, Slavoj Žižek's The Fragile Absolute, Dušan Bjelić's text Is the Balkans the Unconscious of Europe in 1911, and so on. And it could be said that the Balkan is theoretically made, unmade, and remade continuously and with all the aftermaths it carries. Balkan is conceived of as Europe's monstrous twin, a diabolic mirror in which Europe sees itself reflected. Balkan's place is in speech, in language, or if you prefer, in discourse. Balkan, as the inner other of Europe, is a discursive set of beliefs, narratives, pseudo-histories, and is, as is, Europe proper, and Europe proper is the imagined, dominant, and enlightened cultural realm. So we need to inhabit the interruption that this non-European other punctures in the vivid, colorful, and tightly knit canvas of Europe. Dusan Bjelic traced the representations of Balkan in European imaginary. Balkan appears as Europe's political excreta, abject of the polis. And I quote, "Through the Balkan veins, Mephistopheles would have said, streams a special juice, brewed not in nature but in ink and grammar." So, Balkan can be thought as uncanny chronotype of excess, and to read the narratives that have constituted Balkan as such, nationalistic, European, Eastern, Communist or Oriental, Yugoslav or post-Yugoslav, to name a few, would be to be in a process of becoming time-space out, and as Nancy puts it, a thought of a limit is a thought of excess, as I have already mentioned, and Balkan and Europe's inner other is the marking ground of being with, demonstrating its essence in relation as being with the other. The methodology I am employing here is citational, and I wish to continue with 3 citations. These aphoristic citations may not be the best choice there is, nor are they carefully selected from the vast literature on Balkan-Europe relation. They are the workings of an intimate woundings, metaphoric suspensions, and scarrings acquired while thinking the excess, this being with, these mixings and eulogies within my, from my, beyond my corner of the world, beyond the errant spirit of Balkan. The first citation is a notion cited in an essay on the activity of mixing, answering the call to write an eulogy or melange, represented by the city of Sarajevo as a melting point of Balkan's melee. Jean-Luc states the following: "The melee is not accidental, it is originary, it is not contingent, it is necessary, it is not, it happens constantly." The second citation: "In a cult philosophy book of the Serbian intellectual realm of the 1970s, Philosophy of the Province or Filosofia Palanke, Radomir Konstantinović is introducing a new philosophical character, that of Palanka, philosophical notion. And it's Palanka, a small town mentality, a collectivity without an individual, a tribe in agony, and states the following: our experience is provincial." Third citation is dealing is the one that's referencing Rodolphe Gassé's book on Europe. So, dealing with Husserl's, Heidegger's, and Patočka's and Derrida's conceptions of Europe, Rodolphe Gassé investigates what kind of term or a word or a hallucination Europe is. Open quote, "By referring to itself as Europe, Europe therefore avails itself of the first glance upon Europe that occurred from outside it, from Asia. In other words, by calling itself by the name of an other, Europe looks at itself and grasps itself reflectively only through the opaqueness of the name that comes to it from the other." So let me try to clarify these statements. The first one represents Nansian being singular plural notion of being, namely that being is always already being with, and that community is inevitably grounded in the notion of coexistence, no matter how common or in common that communal ground is, or to what amount one believes to belong to a singular self-same and unitary culture, or the culture of sameness. On this plurality of the notion of culture and community, Nancy writes, open quote, cultures, or what are known as cultures, do not mix. They encounter each other, modify each other, and reconfigure each other. They cultivate one another. They irrigate or drain each other. They work over and plow through each other and graft one onto the other. End of quote. Nancy addresses the essay to Sarajevo, the Balkan city in 1990s, and it is a eulogy sent to burning Sarajevo, a melange city entrapped within the ghostly violent inscription of the simplistic eulogy of purity. The second statement is a critique and a vivid description and analysis of Palanka, as if Nancyan simplistic eulogy of purity gains its conceptual character, the one that speaks the language of purity and celebrates the political, cultural, ethnic, and corporeal differentiation of blood cells. This philosophical book was too often interpreted in closed Balkan concepts as a Balkan Palanka, as a political subjectivity deprived of its subject's position and embedded within self-identical collective political body. However, if one reads Konstantinovich's book attentively, certain questions cannot be overlooked. Open quote, if the world is provincial, isn't the province by the same means worldly? End of quote. And this question is followed by insightful conclusion that the provincial world exists only in spirit. The spirit of Palanka is the only absolute Palanka, and this spirit surpasses every imaginable reality of Palanka. The spirit does not have a world for itself into which it could materialize perfectly and its ideal embodiment, as Konstantinovich argues. Thus, it is quite clear that Palanka is not a geographical site or some territorial borderland secluded and gone completely mad. Palanka is the impossibility and necessity of every community. The spirit of Palanka, or the provincial, is an errant spirit, a certain impossible spirit. Open quote, there is no country where it is impossible because it is equally impossible everywhere, with its claim for perfect closure that's beyond time, and hence it is the nothingness of eternity. In a book on the unthinkable, The Politics of Unthinkable Introduction to Anti-Fascist Life by Elisaveta Blagojević, a contemporary Serbian philosopher, so she analyzes this mise-en-scène in Dogville by Lars von Trier through the lens of the philosophy of the province, or the Palanka. The author introduces a figure, in this case a conceptual character of the province, and it is the man of Palanka, Palančanin, with the political surname, open quote, the writer of interjections in search for illustrations, as Blagojević notes. So the the features of this man of Palanka corresponds to one Dogville character, namely Tom Edison Jr. Tom is a focal narrative point of a story of Dogville, small mountain town, given in minimalist scenery, a road sign, a map, or a diagram of a real town or real world. The man of Palanka, Tom, is an errant spirit of Dogville's story, the story of closed, frightened, and violent community whose identity structure is shaken with the arrival of grace, the foreigner, or the other. So, who is Tom? Could he be imagined as an eulogist delivering over and over again the speech of the impossible spirit of community of good, kind people taking pride in their purity and isolated infinity in space and time? Could Tom be the one, the everyman, everything, delivering the simplistic eulogy of purity, a conceptual character of the discourse of sameness, oneness, and ipseity, the pride and joy of every community as such? The man of Palanka is not an individual on a personal path. He is the sum of an experience. He is an attitude, a style. When he is guarding the province, he is actually watching over the attitude and his style, as Konstantinovich argues. So he is keeping watch over the experience, and the only experience we are guaranteed to have is the experience of the provincial. The provincial, or palanka, cannot be mapped or located or placed politically, historically, or geographically, even though it is often done. To think palanka is to invent a different form of thinking, topoetical thinking, a critical choreography of eluding, slipping, delineating, and possible identitary ground as the birthing place of conservatism, nationalism, and fascism. It is to allow and call for mêlée, to recognize and reveal the provinciality of experience of any community and to invent lines of flight. The third statement, or the third citation, represents the significant inversion in theoretical interrogation of the notion of Europe by the name of the other. Europe is all excited, outside, but persistently erasing its outside, what Greek called barbarism of Western lands, that is Europe. And in that way, this notion is making proper Europe the core of self-identity of Europe. Europe constitutes itself on the place of the other. Gachet states that, open quote, Europe has been something like a philosopheme, end of quote, of the order of the philosophical, a shifting idea carrying with itself infinite tasks, various projects, different unities, empires, and all the other. If Europe is a philosopheme, Gachet presumes that is a composite, grafted, and layered construct of the Western mind. If the first two citations are carefully read, the mêlée and palanka are something like a philosopheme too. They are also of the order of the philosophical. These three philosophemes make a deconstructive embrace, as Spivak would say, and they all engage the notion of excess and therefore openness, being mixed, and it just happens all the time, constantly, maybe even stubbornly. So being mixed is the only certainty we can count on, even though our provincial experience demands purity and oneness. Becoming mêlée means to constantly strive towards a hallucinatory melange of undecidedness between the names, proper name, Balkan, Europe, West, East, us, them, between the terms, words, phantoms, myths, narratives, and it is a necessity to decide on the undecidable. If we are not able to decide when dealing with these philosophemes, on what are we thinking of? That is, are we thinking them of as terms, words, names, or concepts? And then perhaps, if that is so, we need to rethink the thinking itself, to examine the tools in front of us. To think Europe, palanka and mêlée, is to track the order of the philosophical, and only by collecting and patchworking images, words, attributions, and discursive statements that already exist. So one must speak within the discourse of the discourse itself in order to let the margin speak. And it is the only way to speak on the Balkans too. The center of the subject is externalized, especially European subject, and the insideness and essence of the subject's position is grounded in the turmoil of the limit, the other, named, evaluated, and structured. Intimate cartographies of the otherness can only be conceived as maps of vulnerability. On these intimate borders, vulnerable bodies interact with other bodies and create places of connectivity and risk. Michel Serret, assumptions, his assumptions delivered in the book The Five Senses, A Philosophy of Mingled Bodies, make a cunning device for the action of melee, for thinking mixed, mingled bodies that display skins in full bloom. Open quote, I exist in this mixed contingency that changes again and again through the agency of the storm that is the other, through the possibility of his or her existence. We throw each other off balance, we are at risk. So, is it then culture which makes sure that nothing new, nothing different can happen to us except for its own alterity? Does our allegiance to our own culture, the culture in which we live, assure us that we will never experience anything different from what we have already experienced, that we will never know anything else but that which we already know? Is it not such a culture a constant reaffirmation of the way in which things are the way they are, in which we ourselves are always the same, and in which we are deprived of the possibility of change, either with regard to ourselves or to the culture that determines us, as Jelisaveta Blagojević argues? Nevertheless, questions remain. Is it possible to think the culture as an open space of excesses and as a multitude? Is it possible, because there is always a choice, to imagine, and we are already on the threshold of creation, of invention, to imagine a culture as a plurality of mixed cultures in which, and outside of it, every space is always already space of the other and inclusive?